The year is 1855. A teenage girl stands in the corner of a Virginia plantation house. Her name is Sarah. She's 14 years old. A white woman enters the room. Her face is twisted with rage. "You stole from me," the woman hisses. Sarah's eyes go wide. "No, ma'am, I never—" "Liar." The word cuts through the air like a blade. Sarah knows what comes next. She's seen it happen to others. The accusation doesn't need proof. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't even need to be true. It just needs to be said. Within the hour, Sarah's back will be shredded. By evening, she'll be sold away from her mother. By next week, the white woman will have forgotten her name. But Sarah will carry the scars forever. This is the story they erased from every textbook. This is the weapon that destroyed more black lives than any other tool of slavery. And it didn't end when slavery did. What you're about to hear will make you angry, but you need to know. Here's what they never told you in history class. The most dangerous weapon in American slavery wasn't the whip. It wasn't the auction block. It wasn't even the chain. It was the accusation. A single word from a white person's mouth could end a black person's life. No trial, no evidence, no mercy. And here's the part that will haunt you. This wasn't rare. This wasn't occasional. This was systematic. It was the entire system's foundation. From 1619 to 1865, millions of enslaved people lived under a legal framework where their word meant nothing and their accuser's word meant everything. But it gets worse, because when slavery ended, the accusation didn't disappear. It evolved. It became Jim Crow. It became lynching. It became Emmett Till. It became the reason we're still fighting today. Stay with me. This gets darker before it gets clear. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked. Imagine you're an enslaved person in 1840s South Carolina. You wake up before sunrise. You work in the cotton fields until your hands bleed. You eat scraps. You sleep on dirt floors. But the physical brutality, that's not even the worst part. The worst part is this. You exist in a world where anyone with white skin can destroy you with a single sentence. The enslaver's wife says you looked at her wrong? Whipped. The enslaver's son says you talked back, sold away from your family. A white overseer says you stole food? Branded, mutilated, or worse. And here's the key. They don't need proof. In fact, the legal system is specifically designed to make sure they don't need proof. Let me show you the receipts. In Virginia's slave codes from 1705, there's a law that states, "No Negro or slave may be a witness against any white person in any case whatsoever." Read that again. A black person cannot testify, cannot defend themselves, cannot speak their truth in any legal setting if a white person is involved. You could watch someone commit murder. You could be the victim yourself. Doesn't matter. Your word is legally worthless. Now imagine living every single day knowing this. Imagine knowing that any white person, even a child, has the power to accuse you of anything and you have zero recourse. Zero defense, zero hope. This is psychological warfare disguised as law, and it was everywhere. South Carolina's Negro Act of 1740, Georgia's slave codes, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina. Every single slave state had some version of this rule. The message was clear. Black testimony has no value. Black truth doesn't exist. Black innocence is impossible. Now here's where it gets truly sinister. Because plantation owners didn't just use this power randomly, they weaponized it strategically. We have the records, not guesses, not theories, actual plantation ledgers, personal diaries, and legal documents that show exactly how this played out. Let me tell you about a case from 1849. A Louisiana plantation owner named Samuel Cartwright kept detailed records of every enslaved person he owned. These records still exist. You can read them today. In one entry, he writes about an enslaved man named Jim. Jim was accused by Cartwright's teenage daughter of speaking inappropriately to her. What did Jim actually do? We'll never know. What we do know is what happened next. He was stripped naked in front of the entire plantation. He was whipped 50 times. Then his Achilles tendons were severed so he couldn't run away. Cartwright recorded the entire thing with a casual tone of someone logging a business expense. The daughter who made the accusation? She was 13 years old. Her word ended Jim's ability to walk. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Cartwright wasn't unusual, he was typical. Historians have analyzed thousands of plantation records from across the South. The pattern is everywhere. False accusations weren't occasional mistakes, they were tools of control. Let me show you how this worked as a system. Strategy number 1, preventing resistance. If enslaved people started organizing, started whispering about escape, started showing any sign of rebellion, the enslaver would accuse the leaders of stealing or plotting violence or any crime that justified brutal punishment. No investigation needed, no proof required, just the accusation, followed by public torture. The message to everyone watching: don't even think about resisting. Strategy number 2, sexual exploitation. This is the part that makes your stomach turn. Enslaved women lived in constant terror of false accusations specifically designed to cover up rape. Here's how it worked. An enslaver or his sons would assault an enslaved woman. When she became pregnant, the white family would accuse her of seducing the white man. She would be punished for his crime. Sometimes she'd be sold away while pregnant. Sometimes she'd be whipped while pregnant. Sometimes worse. The accusation flipped reality upside down. The victim became the criminal. The rapist became the victim. And the legal system backed this up completely. In an 1859 Mississippi court case, a judge literally ruled that enslaved women could not be raped because they were property, not people. Read that sentence again. The law said black women's bodies belonged to white men by definition. Therefore, any sexual act was legally permitted, and if she resisted, she could be accused of attacking her owner. We have testimony from formerly enslaved people collected in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project. These are people who lived through this. One woman named Louisa Piquette described being sold at age 13 specifically because the enslaver's wife accused her of tempting the enslaver. Louisa was a child. The accusation destroyed her life. Strategy number 3, economic manipulation. Here's another tactic that shows up constantly in the records. When enslaved people became too old or too sick to work at full capacity, enslavers would accuse them of laziness or theft. Why? Because it justified selling them for cheap or abandoning them completely. An enslaved person who had worked for 40 years, who had made the enslaver wealthy, would suddenly be accused of stealing food or tools. The punishment? Being sold to the Deep South, where conditions were even more brutal and life expectancy was measured in months. The real reason? The enslaver didn't want to waste resources on someone who wasn't profitable anymore. The accusation provided legal cover for abandonment. But here's the pattern underneath all of this. The accusation served one primary function. It made black people's survival dependent on white approval. You couldn't just work hard. You couldn't just obey. You couldn't just stay silent. You had to anticipate. You had to read minds. You had to perform perfect submission
every single second of every single day. Because one white person having a bad day could destroy you. One white child playing a game could get you killed. One white woman's lie could erase your existence. So how did people survive this? The answer will break your heart and inspire you at the same time. Because enslaved people developed incredibly sophisticated strategies for navigating this nightmare. Let me walk you through some of them. Strategy number 1, the mask. Paul Laurence Dunbar would later write a poem called We Wear the Mask in 1896, but enslaved people were wearing that mask centuries earlier. They learned to perform, to smile when they were furious, to bow when they wanted to fight, to say, "Yes, master," while thinking about freedom.
In interviews with formerly enslaved people, this comes up over and over. You had to watch your face. You couldn't let them see what you were thinking. You had to make them believe you were happy. This wasn't weakness. This was survival. One wrong facial expression could trigger an accusation. One moment of authentic emotion could be labeled as insolence or rebellion. So people learned to split themselves in two: the outer self that white people saw and the inner self that remained hidden and free. Strategy number 2, the witness network. Here's something brilliant that emerges from the historical record. Enslaved communities created informal witness systems. Since their legal testimony meant nothing in white courts, they created their own structures of accountability. If someone was falsely accused, other enslaved people would memorize the truth. They would pass the story down. They would make sure the real version survived. These stories were told at night, in the slave quarters, away from white ears. They were coded into songs, woven into quilts, embedded in folk tales. The legal system said black truth didn't matter. Black communities said, "We'll create our own record. We'll be our own witnesses. We'll remember when they force the world to forget." This is how we have some of the stories we have today. Strategy number 3, strategic illiteracy. Here's something that sounds counterintuitive. Some enslaved people deliberately hid their ability to read and write. Why? Because literacy could trigger accusations. If an enslaver discovered you could read, they might accuse you of forging documents, or stealing books, or planning rebellion. Reading was literally criminalized in most slave states. The punishment for teaching an enslaved person to read could be whipping, imprisonment, or death. So people who learned to read, and many did, secretly, courageously, would hide it completely. They would pretend to be illiterate in front of white people. Then they would teach others in secret, at night, using memory techniques and whispered lessons. Frederick Douglass wrote about this. Harriet Jacobs wrote about this. The pattern is consistent. Knowledge was power, but revealing that power could get you killed. So people became masters of deception. They let white people underestimate them. They let white people believe they were simple, ignorant, incapable. And all the while, they were reading, learning, planning, surviving. Strategy number 4, the chosen silence. This one is painful to talk about. Some formerly enslaved people later described a strategy they called swallowing the words. What does that mean? It means watching injustice happen and forcing yourself not to react, not to speak, not to intervene. Because if you spoke up for someone who was being falsely accused, you'd be accused too. If you defended someone who was being punished, you'd be punished. So sometimes survival meant silence. It meant watching someone you loved be destroyed and doing nothing. The guilt from this haunted people for the rest of their lives. In the 1930s interviews, you can hear it in their voices. Decades after emancipation, they still carried the weight of the moments when they had to choose silence to survive. This is what the accusation system did. It didn't just threaten individuals, it fractured communities. It forced people to betray each other or risk mutual destruction. It was social control at its most effective and most evil. Now let's talk about something that makes this even more undeniable. DNA doesn't lie. In recent years, genetic researchers have studied the DNA of Black Americans whose families have been in the United States for generations. What they found confirms what the historical record already told us. The patterns of genetic mixture between white populations and black populations show something clear. The mixing was not mutual. It was not consensual. It was not romantic. It was overwhelmingly white men and black women. And it happened most intensely during the period of slavery, specifically in regions where slavery was most brutal. Let me translate what that means. The DNA evidence proves that sexual violence was systematic, it was widespread, it was part of the structure of slavery itself. And those rapes were covered up by accusations. When a white man assaulted an enslaved woman and she became pregnant, the accusation against her protected him. The child that resulted, often enslaved themselves, often kept as property by their own father. We're not guessing about this. We have the genetic proof. The Y chromosome studies show that approximately 30% of Black American men have European Y chromosomes, passed down through male lines. That 30% isn't evidence of love stories, it's evidence of violence. And here's what connects this to the accusation system. Those acts of violence were legally protected by the same legal framework that made black testimony worthless. A white man could rape an enslaved woman, she could try to tell someone, and if she did, she could be accused of lying, of seduction, of witchcraft, of anything that justified punishing her instead of him. The law was designed to make abuse invisible. The accusation was the tool that made it legal. Modern historians estimate that by the end of slavery, between 10 and 20% of enslaved people had white ancestry. That's not a small percentage. That's millions of people, millions of rapes, millions of accusations used to cover them up, millions of children born into slavery because their mothers couldn't speak the truth. January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery is ended. You'd think the accusation as a weapon would end too, right? It didn't. It evolved. Let me show you how. When slavery ended, the legal system didn't suddenly start valuing black testimony. It didn't suddenly start treating black people as equals. Instead, it found new ways to maintain the same power structure. Enter the Black Codes. These were laws passed immediately after the Civil War, specifically designed to control freed black people. Mississippi passed its Black Code in 1865, just months after the war ended. Among the provisions, black people could be arrested for vagrancy, being unemployed. Black people could be arrested for insulting gestures towards white people. Black people could be forced into labor contracts that were basically slavery under a different name. And here's the key. Enforcement of these laws relied on accusation. A white person could claim a black person insulted them. The black person would be arrested, fined, and then leased out as prison labor because they couldn't pay the fine. Slavery by another name. Accusation as the trigger. Then came the convict leasing system. Here's how this worked. Southern states would arrest black people on minor or fabricated charges. They'd be convicted. Remember, their testimony was still largely dismissed in court. Then they'd be leased out to plantations, mines, and factories. The conditions were often worse than slavery had been. Why? Because enslaved people were property, so there was an economic incentive to keep them alive.
Convict laborers weren't property. They were disposable. If they died, the state would just arrest more black people to replace them. Hundreds of thousands of black people were trapped in this system, and it all started with an accusation. But the most visible evolution of the accusation as a weapon was lynching. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,400 black people were lynched in the United States. That's the documented number. The real number is likely much higher. And here's what you need to understand. Almost every single lynching began with an accusation. Not a trial, not evidence, not proof, just someone's word. Let me tell you about Emmett Till. You might know his name, but do you know the full story? August 24, 1955, Money, Mississippi. Emmett Till is 14 years old. He's visiting from Chicago. He walks into a grocery store. A white woman named Carolyn Bryant is working the counter. What happened next? The details are disputed. Maybe Emmett whistled. Maybe he said something. Maybe he did nothing. What we know for certain is this. Carolyn Bryant accused Emmett. She told her husband that Emmett had made advances towards her, had touched her, had said inappropriate things. 4 days later, her husband and his half-brother kidnapped Emmett from his great-uncle's house in the middle of the night. They beat him. They tortured him. They shot him in the head. They tied a 75-pound cotton gin fan to his body with barbed wire and threw him in the Tallahatchie River.
When his body was found, it was so mutilated that people could only identify him by a ring he was wearing. The men who killed him were acquitted by an all-white jury. They later admitted to the murder in a magazine interview, knowing they couldn't be tried again. In 2017, 62 years later, Carolyn Bryant admitted something. She lied. Emmett Till never touched her, never made advances, never said anything inappropriate. She made it up. And her lie got a 14-year-old boy tortured and murdered. This is the legacy of the accusation. This is what happens when one group's word is automatically believed and another group's word is automatically dismissed. But Emmett Till isn't the only example. He's just the most famous. Let me tell you about others. Mary Turner, 1918, Georgia. Mary was 8 months pregnant. Her husband was lynched after being accused of killing a white plantation owner. Mary spoke out. She said the accusations were false. She said the lynching was wrong. That was her crime, speaking truth. A white mob hunted her down. They hung her upside down from a tree. They doused her with gasoline and burned her clothes off. Then someone took a knife and cut her stomach open. Her baby fell to the ground. One of the mob members crushed the baby's head with his boot. Then they shot Mary hundreds of times. No one was ever prosecuted. The accusation? That she had made trouble. Jesse Washington, 1916, Texas. Jesse was 17 years old. He was accused of murdering a white woman. He was convicted in less than an hour. Then, before he could even be sentenced, a mob dragged him from the courtroom. They castrated him. They cut off his fingers. They lowered him repeatedly into a fire, burning him alive slowly. 15,000 people watched. They took photographs. Those photographs were turned into postcards and sold as souvenirs. Children attended. It was treated like a public festival. The accusation was enough. The torture was entertainment. I could go on. I could tell you about hundreds more. But here's the pattern. In nearly every case, the accusation involved a white woman. In nearly every case, the black man or boy accused was given no chance to defend himself. In nearly every case, the white community participated or watched or celebrated. And in nearly every case, no one was held accountable. Why? Because the legal system that made black testimony worthless during slavery never actually changed. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment promised equal protection. The 15th Amendment promised voting rights. But the actual practice, the actual lived experience, black people's word was still worth nothing when a white person accused them. Now here's the part where I'm going to make you uncomfortable. Because this didn't end in 1955. It didn't end with the Civil Rights Movement. It didn't end with the Voting Rights Act. The accusation as a weapon is still here. It just wears different clothes now. Let me show you. Central Park 5, 1989. 5 black and Latino teenagers are accused of attacking a white woman in Central Park. No physical evidence links them to the crime. They have alibis, but they're convicted anyway, based largely on coerced confessions. They spend between 6 and 13 years in prison. In 2002, the real attacker confesses. DNA evidence proved the 5 were innocent. The accusation destroyed their teenage years, their education, their futures. And who pushed hardest for their execution before the trial even happened? A real estate developer named Donald Trump, who took out full-page ads in New York newspapers calling for their death. Even after they were exonerated, he refused to apologize. The accusation was more important than the truth. Amy Cooper, 2020. A white woman is in Central Park. A black man named Christian Cooper, no relation, asks her to leash her dog, as required by park rules. She doesn't like being told what to do, so she pulls out her phone. She calls 911. And listen to what she says. "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life." She says it explicitly. She says it as a threat. She knows exactly what weapon she's deploying. She's using the accusation. The same weapon that got Emmett Till killed, the same weapon that destroyed the Central Park 5, the same weapon that has killed and imprisoned and ruined black lives for 400 years. Christian Cooper was lucky. The incident was filmed. It went viral. He wasn't arrested or killed. But think about all the times this happened without a camera. Think about all the times a white woman called the police with a false accusation and there was no video evidence to save the black person she targeted. The accusation is still a weapon, and black people still have to navigate a world where defending yourself can be more dangerous than staying silent. So why don't we learn this in school? Why isn't this the central story we tell about American history? Because it's been actively suppressed. Let me show you how. Textbook analysis, 2018. Researchers at the Southern Poverty Law Center analyzed American textbooks used in schools across the country. What they found, most textbooks spend less than 2% of their content on slavery. When slavery is discussed, it's often sanitized, described as workers or servants. The systematic sexual violence is almost never mentioned. The legal framework that made black people defenseless is barely explained. Reconstruction and the convict leasing system get even less coverage. Lynching is mentioned briefly, if at all, and rarely connected to the broader history. The textbooks make it seem like slavery was bad, Lincoln freed the slaves, and then things got better. That narrative erases the weapon we've been talking about. It erases the accusation. It erases the continuity of anti-black violence. And it erases the fact that the legal system was designed to protect white supremacy, not to provide justice. The lost cause myth. After the Civil War, white Southerners created a propaganda campaign called the Lost Cause. The goal was to rewrite history, to make slavery seem benign, to make the Confederacy seem honorable, to make white supremacy seem natural. Part of this campaign involved creating a specific stereotype, the myth of the black male predator who threatened white women. This myth justified lynching, it justified segregation, it justified all the violence that followed slavery. And it flipped reality upside down. Remember, the actual pattern during slavery was white men raping black women with impunity. But the lost cause myth said the real danger was black men threatening white women. This lie became embedded in American culture. It shows up in films like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, which glorified the KKK and portrayed black men as violent predators. It shows up in laws, in court cases, in the collective imagination. And it's still here today. The destroyed records. Here's something even more sinister. We don't have complete records because records were deliberately destroyed. Plantation owners burned documents before Union troops arrived. Lynching participants destroyed evidence. Local governments lost files. The Equal Justice Initiative has spent years documenting lynchings. They've identified thousands of cases that were never officially recorded. Why? Because the people who committed these murders didn't want them remembered. The people who benefited from the system didn't want it studied. Erasure is part of the weapon. If people don't know the history, they can't understand the present. If people don't know the weapon exists, they can't see it being used. So, what do we do with this information? How do we reckon with 400 years of weaponized accusations? How do we move forward when the past is still so present? First, we have to tell the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the comfortable version. The whole truth. We have to say out loud, the American legal system was designed to make black people defenseless. The accusation was the primary weapon of racial terror, not just violence itself. Sexual violence against black women was systematic, protected by law, and covered up by false accusations. Black people developed extraordinary survival strategies in the face of this horror. And the patterns that began in slavery are still active in American society today. Second, we have to recognize the continuity. This isn't ancient history, this is living memory. There are people alive today who remember Jim Crow, who remember when interracial marriage was illegal, who remember when black people couldn't vote. Ruby Bridges, the first black child to integrate an all-white school in New Orleans, is only 70 years old. John Lewis, who was beaten bloody on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, died in 2020. The people who lynched Emmett Till's killers were never prosecuted. Some of their children and grandchildren are alive today. This isn't the distant past, this is now. Third, we have to change the systems. Because here's the reality. Black people are still disproportionately arrested, convicted, and imprisoned. Black people are still more likely to be killed by police. Black people's testimony is still valued less in courtrooms. The accusation is still a weapon. But it doesn't have to be. We can reform the criminal justice system. We can hold police accountable. We can change sentencing laws. We can teach accurate history. We can believe black voices. We can dismantle the weapon. But only if we're willing to see it first. Here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Despite everything, despite 400 years of accusations, violence, erasure, and terror, black people survived. Not just survived, thrived, created, built, loved, resisted. Let me tell you about the ways people fought back. The Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman and countless others risked everything to lead people to freedom. Every journey was a rejection of the accusation. Every escape was a declaration, "Your word does not define me." Tubman made 19 trips back into slave states. She freed approximately 70 people directly and gave instructions to dozens more. She was never caught. None of her passengers were ever captured. She carried a gun, and she said later, if anyone wanted to turn back, she would shoot them, because turning back meant everyone died. That's the level of courage we're talking about. The rebellions. Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, Denmark Vesey's planned uprising in 1822, Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy in 1800. These weren't random acts of violence, these were organized resistance movements. They failed, most of the leaders were executed, but they sent a message. We will not accept this. We will fight back. You may have the law, but we have our humanity. The testimony. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people gave testimony. They spoke to journalists, they wrote autobiographies, they sat for interviews. Frederick Douglass wrote his story, Harriet Jacobs wrote hers, Solomon Northup wrote his. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project recorded over 2,300 interviews with formerly enslaved people. These people knew their testimony had been worthless under the law, so they made sure it was recorded for history. They said, "You tried to silence us, but we will speak. We will be our own witnesses." The music. Spirituals, work songs, the blues, jazz, hip-hop. Black music has always contained hidden testimony, coded resistance, preserved truth. Wade in the Water taught people how to escape using rivers to throw off dogs. Swing Low Chariot referenced the Underground Railroad. The blues gave voice to pain that couldn't be spoken in white spaces. Hip-hop speaks truth to power in a language the system didn't design. The accusation tried to silence. Music preserved the voice. The community. Black churches, black schools, black neighborhoods. These were spaces where black testimony mattered, where black truth was valued, where black people could be witnesses to each other's lives. The system said, "Your word is worthless." The community said, "Your word is sacred. We hear you. We believe you. We remember." This is how people survived. This is how culture survived. This is how truth survived. But we also have to talk about what this cost, because survival came at a price. The trauma of living under the accusation didn't just affect individuals, it affected generations. The hypervigilance. Black parents have had to teach their children how to survive in a world where an accusation can be deadly. Don't talk back to white people. Keep your hands visible. Don't wear a hoodie. If you're pulled over, put your hands on the dashboard. These aren't paranoid instructions. These are survival strategies passed down through generations because the threat is real. The code switching. The need to perform different versions of yourself depending on who's watching. The black way of speaking at home, the professional way of speaking at work, the natural hairstyle you hide, the anger you swallow, the truth you don't speak. This is exhausting. This is a daily psychological burden, and it exists because of the accusation. Because speaking your authentic truth, looking your authentic self, showing your authentic emotions, these things can still trigger accusations. Aggressive, threatening, angry black woman, scary. The accusation forces performance, forces code switching, forces you to hide parts of yourself just to survive. The stolen joy. This is the part that breaks my heart the most. The accusation has stolen joy, the ability to walk through the world without fear, the ability to trust that your word matters, the ability to assume innocence until proven guilty. Black parents can't let their children be carefree the way white children can be carefree, because carelessness can get you killed. Trayvon Martin was killed for walking while black in a hoodie. Tamir Rice was killed for playing with a toy gun. Breonna Taylor was killed while sleeping in her own home. The accusation, implicit or explicit, was there in every case. He looked suspicious. I feared for my life.
I thought it was a real gun." The accusation excuses the violence, and black people pay the price. So here's what I need you to understand. This isn't history. This is now. The accusation is still a weapon, and it's being used. But you, yes, you watching this, you have power. Here's what you can do. 1. Educate yourself and others. Don't let this history stay hidden. Read the primary sources, read the testimonies, read the research. Then share it, talk about it, make it impossible to ignore. 2. Believe black voices. When a black person tells you about their experience, don't dismiss it, don't debate it, don't ask for proof. Just listen, just believe. The entire system has been designed to make black testimony worthless. You can choose to do the opposite. 3. Question the narrative. When you hear about a crime, when you see news coverage, when you hear someone make an accusation, ask questions. Who's being believed automatically? Who has to prove their innocence? What assumptions are being made? What history is being repeated? 4. Support policy changes. Criminal justice reform, police accountability, sentencing reform, reparations. These aren't abstract political issues. These are about dismantling the weapon. 5. Raise your children differently. Teach them the real history. Teach them to question power. Teach them to value black voices. Break the cycle. Because here's the truth. The accusation has power only because we give it power. We can choose to stop giving it power. We can choose to believe evidence over assumptions. We can choose to value justice over comfort. We can choose to dismantle the weapon, but only if we're willing to see it first. Let me take you back to where we started. Sarah, the 14-year-old girl in Virginia, the accusation, the whip, the separation from her mother. I told you her story at the beginning, but I didn't tell you the end. Sarah survived. We don't know how. We don't have records of what happened to her after she was sold. But we know she survived because her descendants exist, because DNA evidence shows her lineage continued. Somewhere, somehow, Sarah found a way to live, to love, to create life in the midst of death. That's the story underneath the story. The accusation was a weapon designed to destroy black lives, but black people refused to be destroyed. They survived slavery, they survived Jim Crow, they survived lynching, they survived mass incarceration. They created culture that shaped the world, music that moved millions, art that challenged empires, literature that told truth to power. They built communities, raised children, loved fiercely, fought courageously. They turned pain into power, suffering into art, oppression into resistance. The accusation tried to erase them. They refused to be erased. And that brings us to today, right now, this moment. You've watched this video. You've heard the history. You've seen the weapon. Now you have a choice. You can close this tab and pretend you didn't see it, or you can carry this truth forward. You can be a witness. You can be an ally. You can be part of dismantling the weapon. Because the accusation has no power if we refuse to give it power. It has no power if we demand evidence over assumptions. It has no power if we value black voices. It has no power if we tell the truth. This is the hidden chapter of American history. The weapon that destroyed millions of lives. The weapon that's still being used. But it's also the story of survival, of resistance, of people who refuse to be broken. Sarah survived.
Harriet survived. Emmett's mother survived to tell his story. The Central Park Five survived to be exonerated. And the fight continues. The accusation tried to silence black voices for 400 years, but those voices are still here, speaking, singing, testifying. And now you've heard them. What you do with that is up to you. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.